I'm Kuba Podkalicki. Some may know me from Stack Exchange because I spam a lot there. I work in Berlin. We mostly do Player Pro CDFs, and quite recently we work on a bigger package for educational purposes. It's part of a more larger project. Basically, I'm responsible for providing interface for lecturers, teaching assistants, that create lectures, assessments, and so on. And it needs to be user-friendly because although they are familiar with Wolfram language, they are not programmers. So now I'm going to present what I learned during my years in Vision company. I must say it will be quite detailed because, I will sprint through basic stuff. So I imagine everyone being or should be familiar with those tutorials. I'm glad that Lou presented the talk, Understanding of Dynamic Module, because it's part of what I'm going to say. If you are familiar with other talks of front-end team, there is a scale. Lou presented it. So the hardest talk was 300. They are usually around 100. This is 500, I think. So it doesn't mean it is so nice. It means it's quite tough learning curve. Okay, so I will briefly mention basics of performance tuning, like what you should do, not do, but I will really sprint through this. I will mention front-end side programming because it's almost not documented. It's quite useful, and hardly anyone uses this outside Wolfram. Then I will go to the main point of this, the key point of this talk, which is fast prototyping of complex interfaces. It is a narrow, or maybe not a narrow, but it is part of the big picture of things you may want to do with a user interface. But it allows you to address a very broad, I would say, area of use cases. Okay, there are bonuses as usual in those talks. So as a warm-up, basically, I imagine everyone needs to understand that this is what you see is only an image rendered by the front end. Inside, it is a cell structure, which basically consists of cell expressions. The symbols you may think are symbols are just strings, like button here, right? So it's ordinary button, it's input. It's as well the case for this input. And once you send it to evaluation, or maybe yes. Okay. Nothing happens because there are no rules associated, but you can also see it's the same. Okay. There are special rules for typesetting for various different expressions. So button looks like this, but this is what you have in Notebook, really. So basically, you need to understand the box structure behind, and what you see is only the way people choose to display it to you, render. And what you also can notice that those special boxes, like button box, for example, they contain not only strings. So there are symbols inside there too. So this time, the foo is a symbol, which is important because this is part of the bigger topic about how frontend parses this input. So many things will be useful, knowing that there are not only strings that needs to be rendered in some way. Okay, so this is like very brief introduction. Also, very briefly, I need to assume that you know what's wrong here. So basically, you have manipulate, and you want to, okay, it's all terribly slow. Why it's slow? Because you don't optimize your layout. You need to know that frame style is a front-end option. If it is on front-end option, you can specify it as dynamic. So that, because now wherever I vary C, the whole body of manipulate is evaluated again and again. It's slow, as expected, because the C-plot is this time slow for those performance goal and plot points options. So now yeah, it's smooth. I mean, because the C in manipulate is directly connected via frontend to the frame style. I mentioned tutorial, advanced dynamic functionality. Everything is more detailed there, so I'm just briefly mentioning it so that we kind of have complete but brief picture of what we are going to do next. Okay, so I didn't want to focus only on one hairy trick I find really useful, so I decided I will mention front-end side programming too. So you need to know that when you hit Shift-Enter, everything goes to the kernel. There is a parsing stage on the front-end side, on the kernel side, then is evaluation, typesetting, and so on, formatting. Not everything is important now, but you need to be aware of this communication, how it goes. There are 3 links. You can learn about them in this tutorial. I mentioned it earlier too. But front-end can do stuff itself. And it's faster because it doesn't need to communicate with the kernel. It's more limited because Mathematica is so versatile that it wouldn't be possible to probably allow everything to happen front-end. Well, we have kernel for this eventually. So the first section is link snooper. I won't launch it now because we don't have time for this. This is basically a tool which is built in, so this is a setup. It's built in Mathematica, so Java listener kind of, you can see how the communication goes between front and kernel. You cannot use it to debug complex programs, but you can test ideas, whether something you implement really works front-end side, or there is communication. Maybe some other packages interfere, like syntax, auto-completion or something like this. You don't want to. So it's fun to know what's going on, to report bugs to Wolfram. Now, yeah, okay. So basic example of front-end side programming is maybe not obvious, but known to everyone. This dynamic module. Those variables are front-end governed, let's say. They're owned by front-end. So you can see we have 200 sliders here, and it is quite smooth, because there is no calculations needed to be done by the kernel. So yeah, it's quite smooth. Here, however, we have a kernel variable. So, well, it of course depends on machine, but you can see it's lagging. And this is the simplest case. So of course, you don't have 200 sliders usually, but basically it's to show you how it will scale if you do things wrong. I mean, you should try to keep those small state variables inside dynamic module variables. If you have big data, on the other hand, it's not good to keep them in the front end because it's heavy. The more that dynamic module tries to write things down to the notebook, which takes time too. So you don't want to do this. Again, not the main point, briefly mentioning. Okay, what people don't know, what is very useful is that animator is implemented in the front end. So if you display an animator which is auto-running, it doesn't need to communicate to the kernel. And if this state variable is connected to something that is also kind of front-end related, you might create completely front-end side animations, actions, whatever. So here, this is part of the question I asked recently. This is the progress indicator, like custom one. Of course, the bitmap is from Wolfram resources also, but it is run completely front-end side, so you can run the loop or whatever. Okay, you don't see the cell, but it is basically running. Yeah, so I aborted it, and nothing is interrupted. I assume you should know that if you have dynamic evaluations, they by default are run by preemptive link. So yeah, while something is running, it can still be kind of done, because preemptive link can interfere without blocking completely. So yeah, things are possible, but this is nice because it works completely front-end side. I will, of course, not expect you to to grasp this code at once now. It is for further appreciation. You also may have noticed that there are things mentioned with front-end related context. There are FE private, front-end context. I wish it was more documented. It isn't, but there are things, there are tricks that you can use to program things that typeset to structures that are run completely front-end side. So here we use this reference to the bitmap, which won't be written into the notebook, which saves you space in this notebook. If you have many images, because you use them in your interface, you don't necessarily want to have them burned there. You may want to reference them, the more if they duplicate in many places, in many controls. So this is the way. What I also want to stress here is that this is based all on experience, so I cannot recommend like good tutorial on this. But for example, here, I could have made animator from 2 to 2p, or from 0 to 2p, right? So that I can rotate around t. And don't do multiplication here, but there. But then, if you know, you would have known that animator would need to rescale, because by default it works from 0 to 1. That can be done from front-end side. Otherwise, it needs to go to the kernel to rescale, and this is the way to do this. You don't add the ranges to the animator. You need, but this, however, is a multiplication that front-end can do itself. This multiplication doesn't need to go to the kernel. So not everyone is straightforward. You cannot always ask the front-end to do stuff, but quite often it can, which is very nice. All those things are kind of enhancements for the interface you may want to create. So I don't find it like very general solutions, but nevertheless, I would like to mention this. Okay, so this is the tutorial I mentioned where front-end side programming is mentioned. There are 2 lines or 1 section, something like this. And here is, I think, very useful example. So it's one cell of a style sheet, which shows you that your notebook should have background color different. It's red or green, whether you have below 11.1 version or not. And while it's important, you could have put there dynamic, because we already know you can have dynamic front-end related options. So you could have put there dynamic, but what I find very important here is that this type of code won't trigger dynamic warning in CDFs, for example. And people are terrified, because we often give CDFs to lawyers. They don't know what's happening. They think we've broken something, because there is this pop-up or toolbar at the top that you need to enable dynamic updating. They don't know what's going on. And this doesn't trigger this. So, because front-end operations are limited, and if we put here dynamic, we can do many things. It will go to the kernel and so on, and now we don't. So that's small but important improvement. Okay, so one needs to know front-end limits also and how the typesetting works. Again, why is this worse than this? Because front-end doesn't know how to display a list, let's say. So front-end knows without the kernel how to display a number, if it is a number or a string, for example. But this list needs to go to the kernel and be typeset. So it's like a list of small features, issues that you need to be aware of, but then it is quite useful. You can enhance your user interface. Okay, so there's a problem. I won't show it correctly here because I think it's fixed in 11.3. But basically, there is a current value of window size. And if you move window around without changing the window size, this dynamic will be triggered. So you want to fix it before front-end Wolfram fixes this, because you have stuff to do. So this is an application of how to fix it. I should mention that this FE private may look like discouraging, but you don't need sometimes to use them, those contexts, because frontend can parse it like a set. Frontend knows if, switch, and so on. So you can just write it, and it should parse it correctly, but somehow I have a feeling that it's better to use it, the useful name, just to be clear about what's going on. And this is pretty dense piece of code. how it helps us. So basically, we know that this current value window size will be triggered when the the window is moved only. So we set the CWS variable to this size. But if we move, it doesn't change. So the dynamic we really care about, which is here, won't be triggered because CWS doesn't really change. And all this is done front-end side because all those structures typeset as front-end structures, and that front-end understands. Again, that was not the main point, so we are going to the main point now. That was like a teaser. Okay. This is the big stuff. Basically, we want to write the big package, and we find it hard to structure the code correctly, or in a way that's maintainable, and so on. So, what's state management? I think, do you see how we have variables stored here and controlled here? That is state management. So you have storage and control, and you pass things around. Here, you pass things around by typing them explicitly, which is fine for manipulates, for simple applications. But as soon as you go further, you need something more. So the basic like idiom is to pass it by reference with dynamic, whatever. You need to hold the evaluation and pass it to the controller. Yeah, so this is what you do, and it is fine. I mean, it doesn't do anything, but basically it works. So, but there comes a problem now, because that's also a basic stuff. And now, dynamic system is very special because you refresh dynamics based on mutation of symbols, front-end, or whatever symbols. So if there is a mutation or change of the value of the symbol, it will trigger dynamic objects which are linked to the symbol. Now, if you have an association and, let's say, controller for each key, if you change one key, everything linked to this association will be kind of considered triggered. There is no separation on keys. There is no separation on or parts. So what? Okay, I think I have an example. Yeah. Yeah. So this is the common container problem. So yeah, this is the list. You would like to control it or to control only the number there, but you can see everything is updated because you change only part. I mean, okay, that's how it works. So how do you do this? You pass this, you create separate symbols for each keys, for example. So you have key 1, key 2, whatever, can be arbitrary. But now you are in a state where there are 40, let's say. It happened to me that there were even more variables, and you need to pass them like we did here, right? So you need to write your modules which accepts all those. So good luck with not making mistakes. Good luck with having patience to do this, because I don't. And if you know from the beginning what do you want, it's easy. But I often work with people who don't. So we prototype with them. They say, okay, now let's change this. So they want to show, let's say, oh yeah, here. So enjoy this image. So this is an interface, let's say. Ignore colors. And they now, it's almost done. And then it's almost done, and they say that in this place, they need a control that controls something here. If you structure your code in a modular way, now you need to create a new variable that will pass from the green dynamic module here, and then here, and meanwhile, it will be passing through modules that don't care, like those red ones or pink ones. They don't care about this variable, but they need to pass them down. And still, there is a problem of the length that you need to, did I make a mistake with the order or not? Yeah, that's terrible. Yeah, that was the motivation to do something about this. So the first thing is to understand dynamic module. Yeah, so we did the main loop recap very briefly. So this is how dynamic module input looks. And now Yeah, that's okay. First, we have parsing stage. So every symbol has a context. I ignore symbol context because it doesn't matter. So basically, you have X, which was found in global context. You have Y, which was found in general utilities context. I will show why it's important, but basically, this is the parsing stage. This is before evaluation. So it was sent to the kernel, parsed. The box structure was sent and parsed to this. Then it's going to be evaluated. Here, nothing fancy happens because dynamic holds it, and dynamic module evaluation leads only to this. But already we see that there is the dynamic module values option added. Nothing fancy happened yet. Now we have a typesetting stage. So it's converted to boxes, like everything later. And we can see already something changed. There is $$ here. And dynamic box, of course, looks slightly different, but we see that something changed in the structure. We go further. There is an initialization, like I don't know how to call it because I'm not a Wolfram employee. I don't know how it's called internally, but basically after typesetting and displaying, there is also initialization, of course, of dynamic module, but we can also see that this global was changed to cell context. So I infer the current context is replaced manually so that we can kind of easily, for example, switch the context of the notebook and it will work, stuff like this. We just need to understand what's going on, because now we can abuse it. Okay, this was just a brief description of how dynamic module works. Lou presented something more user-friendly, I believe, but not full. So I prepared something full here, full from what I can infer from the experiments. So it's a bonus. We won't go there because it's not important, but feel free to do this. Okay, so let's go and create GUI that doesn't have a problem of passing variables around. You need to create them. But you can even do this manually, or automatically. I have a deeply nested association for the specification of this assessment I mentioned earlier. And I generate dynamic modules automatically so that each key is a separate dynamic module variable. But then you have a problem. How do you access this? Well, you don't need to pass them, so you need to access them in controllers. We'll see how it can be done. So this GUI, don't be afraid. It's only so complicated because it has this initialization, so we want to show a progress indicator at the beginning, and then my panel. But we can already see that my panel doesn't need to have any store X, for example, passed around. The store X is only context. It's not special. I just put it there because you need to be of control of the context however you want. This is one way. You can use full names, but there are other ways. It doesn't matter now. OK, so let's define my panel. It's also nested. Why not? I mean, it's complex application. So you have my controller, my plot, invalid button, and valid button. We'll see why invalid. And my controller, yeah, finally. OK, so now we can abuse how typesetting and scoping works. You need to be of control of the context, like I said, so you need to use the same context, then the name of the variable followed by $. But you can only use this trick in things that will typeset as symbols. So dynamic typesets and contains dynamic box, which contains this as a symbol, not as a string, for example. So if you don't have dynamic, just a store, then it will be a string. Doesn't matter. We don't use it. But here it will, because we want frontend to parse it further. Each time dynamic module initializes, it creates frontend variable that is shared between frontend, kernel, and stuff. So at the end, this is, if you evaluate this basic stuff, you see, this is what is really there. There are FEX $34. We don't know this dynamic module number up front, and it changes always. So we want frontend to do this. So we kind of, I didn't want to write user interface in box language. So this is like a hybrid. I allow frontend to do what it's supposed to do. So I do this, like here. We also have dynamic, which wraps this. Basically, we need this in controllers, right? So they will be used correctly if you do this right. Now, you want to, for example, change X from the procedure triggered from a button. which, involves heavy calculations in the kernel. This won't work if you define it like this, because this invalid reset function, it won't be parsed by the front end. It's known for the kernel, and front end only sends this. So to have valid way to send stuff to the kernel, we need to make it visible to the front end, basically. So yeah, this is the valid button. It's the same, but we only pass to those functions what we need. And before it is sent to the kernel, this is already parsed, and it is already a correct variable. So let's try to run it. Yeah, so I mean, maybe it's not very outstanding, but we don't pass any variable anywhere. And it can be arbitrarily long list of variables that we would need to. And yeah, I mean, that's not what I want to do, you see? Okay, so this is just not related proxy indicator, and now everything works. Invalid reset doesn't work because it's not parsed correctly. Valid reset works. I mean, I love it. I use it on a daily basis now. Well, the only problem, of course, is if you have nested, you need to give meaningful names for variables, because if you have nested structure of dynamic modules and the names interfere, yeah, but you should give meaningful names to the variables anyway, so that's a good habit to have. Which also means that it's not perfectly suited to create controllers for use for others, so like defining a slider for someone. It's perfect for creating widgets or applications which you have full control on, or your team, because you know what's going on. But it's worth it, yeah. So you can see this is how a button with this looks like, and yeah, this is a symbol which before evaluation is sent to the kernel correctly now. Yeah, so I would like to. I'm not sure how. Okay, stop. Sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I needed to finish. I don't know. Questions probably can be asked outside. I will leave, of course, this notebook. I'm happy to answer questions because the main point is to gather attention. The main point is this is like one piece of the puzzle. We need to have best ways to handle user interface generation for complex cases, because this is what I struggle a lot. And I would like feedback, discussion. Yeah, thank you.